God, those dogs have been here all week, keeping an eye on things, making you behave. It's been great to have you all here this week. It's great to see so many of you here this morning, and mums and dads as well. We've been learning about David the shepherd boy, who became a king. We're going to look again this morning at the story of David and Goliath. David and Goliath. Even though in that story David's still a shepherd boy, he's doing the sort of things that kings do. He's rescuing people. And that story, the story of David and Goliath, helps us understand good news. The Bible is full of good news. It's full of good news for children. It's full of good news for grown-ups too. So as we look at this story of David and Goliath, we're going to try and understand, first of all, the story of David and Goliath, and then how that story fits in with the big story of the whole Bible. Even though the Bible has lots of stories in it, real great stories, stories that we know well, like David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph and his brothers, all these stories fit together into one big story, one big set of good news. So we're going to think about that this morning. The Bible is a story of good news about what God is doing in our world all those years ago and today as well. So let's start with the story of David and Goliath. The story starts with battle lines drawn, doesn't it? There's two great hills, two great mountains. Imagine a mountain away there on my left and a mountain away there on my right. And on the mountain on the right over there, there's a great army. Who do you think's on that side?
David and Goliath?
Not quite. A great Israelites. David, he's an Israelite. So the Israelites are away on that side. A great army. They're God's people. And there's another army away on this side. All their armour on, all their weapons out. Which army's on this side? The Philistines. And as the Israelites, they maybe had their binoculars out and they're looking across the valley and they're looking at the Philistine army. And as they get focus, out steps at the front a real big Philistine. A Philistine that's much bigger than any of the other Philistines. He's about 2 or 3 foot bigger. What's his name? He's Goliath. He's a giant of a man. He's got this huge shield. He's got this spear that we're told is like a weaver's beam. It's a real big piece of wood, that we couldn't hardly lift. He has that as a spear for throwing. And he's got all this armour on. And he is terrifying. He's terrifying. And as the Israelites look out across the valley, Goliath steps forward and he shouts across the valley at the Israelites. And he says, "Choose someone to fight me. Just one man. Choose one man to fight me. If he wins, we Philistines will be your slaves. But if I win," says Goliath, "you will be our slaves forever." As the Israelites heard Goliath shouting, what do you think they thought? What do you think they thought? Go on. He's too big and scary, and they were terrified. They were terrified looking at Goliath. Have you ever been really scared before? Someone jumped out at you, made you jump, and your heart starts racing? No? No? Oh, have they? Okay. Well, this was like that. The Israelites were super scared, but this doesn't just go on for a few seconds. This went on for 40 days and 40 nights. Every day, every morning, Goliath would step out and he would shout his challenge, "Choose someone to fight me." And every day, the Israelites would be scared stiff. I wonder what Saul was thinking. Who was Saul? He was the king. If anyone should fight Goliath, who should fight Goliath? The king. King Saul should fight Goliath. He was the one that was meant to rescue God's people. But he was just as scared as everyone else. And as I said, that went on for 40 days. And in the Bible, suddenly the camera switches and we go away from the battlefield and we go to a field, a meadow. And in the meadow, there's just a few sheep and a little boy, a young boy. Who do you think we're looking at now?
David.
David. David the shepherd boy. He's out watching the sheep. And David, we know a few things about him. He's only young, maybe a teenager. He's got a lot of brothers. How many brothers? 7 brothers. Imagine having 7 brothers. That'd be terrible. Especially if there were 7 older brothers. I've got 1 older brother, that's enough. But 7 brothers. And we know something else about David. Not many other people know this. It's a bit of a secret. But David, he's been anointed to be the next king. Shh, don't tell anyone. He's going to be the next king, but no one else really knows. But at the minute, David's just a shepherd boy. And David's dad comes to him and goes, David, come here a minute. Take this grain, got 10 loaves of bread and 10 cheeses. Just take this and go up to the battlefield and see what's going on up there. See what your brothers are doing. Take some food for them and just bring word back to me. So off David goes back to the battle lines. He comes to the 2 mountains, the Philistines on one side, the Israelites on the other side. And just as David lands up, who do you think steps out on this mountain? Goliath. Goliath steps out and he shouts his challenge, "Choose someone to fight me." And everyone's scared. And David looks up and he goes, "Who does this Philistine think he is? This great overgrown Philistine. Isn't someone not going to go and teach him a lesson? He's mocking the people of God. He's mocking the God of heaven. Someone should teach him a lesson." And David's brothers, what do you think they say? "Buzz off. Stop poking your nose in. Just go home. Who's looking after those sheep?" David said, "I'm just saying, I'm not scared of Goliath." And David keeps on saying this, and word gets round to King Saul, and King Saul says, "Bring David to me." And David goes up to King Saul, and he says to King Saul, I will fight Goliath. I'm not scared. He says, "God will deliver me. God's delivered me from a bear and from a lion. I will fight this giant too." Saul says, okay, you can go, but you must take my armor. You've got to wear my armor. He dresses David up in his armor. He says, "You're going to need a real good sword and a real good shield and some good armor if you're going to fight the giant." And David tries it on and it's too big. He can't move. "This is no good," he says. "I'll just take my sling and my stones and my shepherd's stick. That will do. That will do. God will deliver me." David is so confident in God. David knows God will deliver him. Now imagine the scene. Goliath, he's walking down from this mountain. And David, he's walking down from this mountain. It must have looked pretty silly, mustn't it? A great huge giant in his armor. And a little shepherd boy with a stick and a sling. It would have looked foolish. Silly. David would have looked so weak. And Goliath thought so. Goliath shouted, "Who are you come to fight me?" He mocked David. He mocked David's God. And David shouts back, Hey, Goliath, I come to fight you in the name of the Lord. He will give me victory over you. The Lord will save us. David is just so confident. And down they go, running down the valley. Goliath down this side, David down this side, running towards each other. Now imagine if we were to press the pause button. We were to press the pause button at this minute. And so Goliath paused and David pauses. And just imagine you're one of those Israelite soldiers. You're sat up there on that hill and you're one of those Israelite soldiers. Everything is riding on David. Do you know what happens if David loses? You become a slave of the Philistines forever. Everything rests on David's shoulders. And you're looking there, and David looks pretty weak. I bet their teeth were chattering. And David will press play again. David sets off running. He gets his stone on his sling, and he's round and round and round and round and round and round and round. Keeps going. And then he throws his stone. We all know what happens, doesn't it? Where does the stone go? Straight over Goliath's head, misses him and sinks into the ground. Is that right? Yeah. What? Straight into his forehead. And he hits the deck. And then David runs over and he gets Goliath's own sword and finishes the job off. And the Philistine champion is defeated. They all run away in fear. That's the Philistines. And suddenly all the Israelites who just a moment ago whose teeth were chattering, they jump up and they shout and they chase the Philistines off. And David, he's the unlikely hero, isn't he? He's the hero. He defeats the enemies of God's people on their behalf and leads them into victory. God rescues his people by the hand of David. That's what the story's all about. So that's the story of David and Goliath. God working a rescue for his people through a little shepherd boy. But how does that story help us understand the good news of the Bible? How's that story good news for children here and good news for mums and dads here? Well, we could write over the story of the whole Bible. The whole Bible could be given this title: God rescues his people by his chosen king. That's the story of David and Goliath. That's also the story of the whole Bible. God rescues his people by his chosen king. And David, he's a king. He's not at this point, but he does become a king, and he's a great king, but he's not the king. He's not the greatest king. Who is the king? We did it in our memory verse. God is the king. And the story of the Bible goes on after David, and it keeps on going. And there's these promises to David. God comes to David, and he says to David, David, one of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, someone who's going to come from your family, is going to be a forever king. He's going to be a king of a forever kingdom. And as we read our Bibles, we read on years and years and years and years after David had lived and died. One of his grandchildren was born in Bethlehem. Jesus, he's a man like us. But Jesus is also God. God stepping into our world. And Jesus is God's chosen king. And when Jesus comes, you know what? He doesn't look impressive. He doesn't come and sit on a throne with a great crown on his head. He comes and he's born in a manger. And he grows up and he doesn't look very impressive. And the whole of his life seems to be pointed towards one event. Even from his birth, the whole of Jesus' life, God's king, is pointed towards the cross. It's pointed towards the cross. That's what we remember at Easter. And do you know what's happening at the cross? Jesus is stepping out into the valley to fight. Just like David did, Jesus steps out into the valley to fight. He's fighting an enemy that leaves us shaking with fear. He's fighting an enemy that leaves the whole of humanity shaking with fear. Ever since the Garden of Eden, when our first parents, Adam and Eve, ever since the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they turned their back against God. The human race has been dominated by sin and death. Sin and death. A great enemy that leaves us shaking with fear. An enemy that we know we cannot fight. No one wanted to fight Goliath because they knew they couldn't win. And we can't fight sin and death because we know we will never, ever win. And you know what's happening at the cross? Jesus, God's King, steps out into battle. And he looks very weak and very foolish. And people mock him and make fun of him. They put a kind of joke sign above his head saying, Jesus, the King of the Jews, but they're just making a joke. That's not really what they think. And Jesus dies on a cross. And he's put in a tomb and it's sealed. And for 3 days it looks like Jesus has lost. It looks like he's stepped out into the valley to fight a great enemy, and it looks like he's lost. But what happens after 3 days? Holly-Ann? He comes back to life. Jesus comes back to life. It's a bit like Goliath. You know how he was finished off with his own sword? Jesus destroys death by his death. Jesus goes into death and breaks it. That That's the good news. The King fights and wins. This is the heartbeat of the Christian hope. Jesus conquered so that he may deliver his people. And the good news this morning is that the victory that Jesus wins over sin and death is not just for himself. Jesus fights this battle on behalf of his people. Now this is a real important question. Who are his people? Who are his people? The Bible says anyone who comes to King Jesus, anyone who comes to him and trusts in him, they're his people. Anyone who will say, okay, Jesus, I'm not the king, even though we all like to pretend we're king of our life. Anyone who will say to Jesus, I'm not the king, you're the king, I want to trust and follow you, you become one of his people. And he promises you that you can share in his victory. We don't have to fight for ourselves. We just have to receive Jesus. And then we get to be like those Israelites. They didn't fight Goliath, did they? Israelites didn't fight Goliath, but they got to share in the victory. Their sadness was turned to joy. And that's just like us when we trust Jesus. We're nearly done. We're nearly done. One day, Jesus was stood at the tomb of one of his best friends. One of his best friends had just died. A chap called Lazarus. That's a funny name. Anyone called Lazarus here? No? No one snuck in at the back called Lazarus? And he stood at the tomb of Lazarus. And just before, he comforted Lazarus' sister with these words. He said to Lazarus' sister, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though he dies, he will live. Jesus says, whoever believes in me, even though he dies, he will live. And then he asked Martha a question. That's Lazarus' sister. He says, do you believe this? Do you believe this? And I guess I want to ask each of us that question this morning. Children, grown-ups, do you believe in King Jesus this morning? That's the promise that Jesus gives us, victory over death. That even though we die, and if we all live long enough, that's what awaits us. Even though we die, we will still live. David and Goliath is probably one of the best known stories in the Bible, isn't it? I think just about everyone's heard of the story of David and Goliath. The best known verse in the Bible is John 3:16. I'm just going to read John 3:16 and two other verses after it. Just want you to listen and think about what Jesus is saying in these words. And think about, what is my response to King Jesus? Because this is a question that's just of utmost importance. So we just read these verses. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son, that's Jesus, into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. But whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. That's important. Are you trusting in King Jesus this morning? I'll leave that question with you. I'll hand back to Helen. Thank you.